It's a well-known problem or issue or thing in the space is now you have this ability for an object to exist digitally. You can say that a digital thing has entityness, it has aura. And if you're from the art world, this concept of aura is very classic, a Walter Benjamin thing. It's this sense of like nounness that now this thing can be an object and it has a consistent set of identity, kind of like the ship of Theseus. And that's really, really interesting. But what occurs really quickly is we find that the meaningfulness of any object, both physical and digital, um, is derived almost entirely from the context that it lives in, the story that it lives in, the narrative that it lives in, and importantly, the space that it lives in, and how that contributes to its meaningness as well. And so that's why I think this book from 1964, Notes on the Synthesis of Form from Christopher Alexander, is a seminal classic text from God knows how long ago, 80 years now. Um, is exactly like it's written like you're trying to build a website today, and it's all based on physical architecture and the design of physical space. But the more abstract form, the more abstract problem that Christopher Alexander is trying to solve or to describe is you have a problem, and it mostly involves how people interact. But you have a problem. How do you design a solution to fit it? And this is like very design thinking, which is nothing new to us today, but was kind of a big deal in the past. And so in the book, he goes on to describe like, hey, this is how I think about design. You have a problem, which he calls the context, and you have this definition of the problem is the context, and then you have a form, which is a solution that fits that context. And he speaks about design as the process of finding form and context fit. Really straightforward when you think about it. And I think that's useful for designing digital spaces, because one of the premises in the book is in architecture. He was saying, here, I'll quote the sort of two problem statements that he presents in the book for architecture is that, hey, the substrate, the base, this context of the world we live in is changing so rapidly in like so rapidly that this generational iterative approach to adapting how we live, and he's speaking specifically to houses and architecture space, um, can no longer this generational iteration can no longer sufficiently adapt in time, right? The process of learning from those who came before you, changing something, waiting to see what happens, is too slow for this rapidly changing world. And then two is that the problems become so complex that no one person can fully understand the problem, the context. And he then goes on to provide this framework and this sort of process for breaking down problems into little modular problems and then recombine and then solving those modular contexts, producing a form, and then recombining, sort of unwinding that stack to arrive at a shared or a compiled form. And this is all very abstract. And I'll get into like a very specific example. But I want to draw parallels to the medium shift of how humans are interacting in the physical space to how, especially the last year, humans had to interact in the digital space. And it's the similarity is that, hey, we're still human, we still want to interact. These base desires are the same. The medium by which we do that has suddenly shifted. And this shift was inevitable, right? We're becoming more digital by the day. COVID is just like this accelerant. And this was really prevalent the first few days or the first few weeks of quarantine when everything went digital. And it's like, hey, we have this concept, this physical experience. In our case, we were looking, pre-COVID, AJ and I were working on this problem of like the gallery experience. Like you go to an art gallery. What is the digital equivalent of that? And it's worth specifying the difference between this idea of transposition, this rebuilding brick by digital brick of an experience, and the translation, which is much more Christopher Alexander, where you break down this problem into its sort of constituent parts, into a modular problem, and then solve that in abstract, and then combine those abstract solutions into a concrete solution. And so we sort of applied this thinking to the space of digital gallery. And so let's like go deep into that. One of the, here I have a list. Let me, so I don't forget them all. Um, oh, and it's worth noting that in the book, the connection between a context, a defined context of like, hey, we want humans to be able to feel the presence of other humans, and the form, what that solution is. Maybe it's avatars that are three-dimensionally next to each other, or maybe it's Figma cursors with a name around it, or maybe it's something even more digitally native, like a little blur over here when someone's near you or something like that. Those two things, when they are combined together and the map between them, problem to solution, is called a pattern. And so if you want to get more into Christopher Alexander, go into like a pattern language is his, there's a whole series. There's like 8 books in the series. Um, but that's the idea, is that it's a diagram or a pattern that describes a solution to a context. And so, for example, in the gallery example, we have this idea of, okay, you have an art gallery. Instead of recreating that brick by digital brick, think three-dimensional walls with art on the wall, with avatars that you move with your keyboard, all very like skeuomorphic. And it works because it relies on things that we already understand, but is not necessarily digitally native. It's not the most optimal solution. And to give weight to that claim is, for example, when iOS was first created, you have this like new medium of a touch screen. Nobody knows how to use it. And so the first thing they do as designers is rely on things we already know, which are this very physical nature of how to interact with something. So, for example, the Notes app had scripty font and a page turning animation and a crumple sound as it went into a wastebasket, like all very physical metaphors. And those were required for people to understand how to use this new medium. But what we found is over the years, say 10 of them, we've approached a more ideal version of digital computing where the same problems are still being solved, right? You can still take a note and trash it. You can still like go from one note to another. But instead of relying on these physical metaphors, we found more digitally native ones, like, for example, using a sans serif font, which is easier on the eyes on a digital screen. You can still trash things, but instead of a crumple, it's sort of like a squeeze magic thing in the case. You like instead of that, instead of like very high shadows, you have still the concept of a Z index. Things can be on top of each other, but that's much more digitally native. Like there's a bit of a shadow because that's useful for us to cue in on Z indexes, but it's not the heaviness of like a physical paper texture over another thing. And so this sort of happens on any medium shift, I think. And that's one example. And so to reapply that learning here, I'm like, okay, we have a digital gallery. The obvious answer is to make it three-dimensional, give people an avatar, have them walk around, proximity, audio, whatever. And that works because it solves the same problem. Of course it works because, it worked in real life. You recreate real life, it still kind of works. But the more optimal solution is going to involve sort of designing from first principles. What are the aspects of going to an art gallery that are useful? And so we can kind of break those down. One is, I think, the curated narrative, this idea of following a storyline. However, one thing that's really cool about an art gallery is that you get to peel off and go do your own thing whenever you want. And so it's this sort of choice, this sort of like spontaneity of decision making where it's like, hey, there's a curator, there's this way of doing this thing, but I can also just go do my own thing. And so that's like an interesting property. And you get that kind of for free with 3D space. But if you don't necessarily require the concept of 3D space, which I don't think you do, then you must solve this problem slightly differently. So how do you create spontaneity along a narrated path? So that's one sort of base context. Then you have other aspects of a gallery that are really interesting, like event tickets. Is it important that you pay to enter? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Is it important that you can take your ticket stub and keep it as a piece of memorabilia? Maybe, maybe not. What about entrance fees and attendance limits? Like, is an attendance limit a feature or a bug of physical space? And you kind of think about this problem. It's like, okay, cool. Well, now we have digital space. Nothing is scarce by default. Physical scarcity exists because there are walls around the building, fire codes, all of that. Time is scarce because opening and closing hours, it's in a specific space. So if you're going to the Met, you have to be in New York. You can't go to the Met anywhere else. But now we have a digital medium where it's universally acceptable, or accessible any time of the year, any time of day, anywhere in the world. Is that a feature? Is that a bug? And if it's a feature, how do you lean into that? And if it's a bug, how do you reintroduce, different aspects of the experience such that you get what you want? And so it's worth noting that all of these are, hyper specific to your context. It's like there's no one solution. Um, Another aspect is this sense of magic space in like a gallery. How do you create this, social norm of quietude and introspection, or looking at a piece of art and caring about it? How do you do that online, right? You have this, you know, it's the web. You can go anywhere, anytime. With a Command T, you're on a different planet, right? Like, how do you, and is that a feature of a gallery? And if it is, how do you replicate that online without, you know, I mean, there's no digital equivalent of that. So it's kind of hard to transpose. And so, like, one example is using the medium. Okay, make this tab full screen. And then if you close it, you've sort of indicated that you're not focusing on this thing anymore. Now you have this digitally native sense of, okay, cool, this person's not interested. Maybe kick them out of the gallery, let them go do something else, right? Like that kind of translation. You have this sort of social norm stuff where it's like, how do you craft a social norm? And then the social layer, of course, is like, I want to go to a gallery with my friends. I want to talk to my friends. And then also there's this idea of serendipity of like, I'm there for the public. I'm at an opening. I want to meet other people. How do you do that digitally, not like naturally and natively? And so I think the short-term solutions that we jump to, certainly work. And I guess to the point of digital event, um, what's that called? Burnout, that they were mentioning in the last panel. It's like these things work, but they don't work super well. And I feel like there's a more natural expression of these, a more natural expression to solve these problems. And it will be reliant on, you know, we're humans, we're spatial creatures. We live in a three-dimensional world. We understand gravity. We understand all of these things, and it will be based off that. You can look at spatial software, for example, but it won't necessarily be tied. All of these assumptions we make around how the real world is can be cast away in digital space. And so there's this, almost too much freedom associated with this problem space. And so I think a really helpful way to design for that is to break down your context into subcontexts, this like first principles thinking, solve it abstractly. So like, what are the, I want to interact with other humans. How do I want to do that? There's chat, there's audio, there's proximity, there's video, there's poking people on Facebook. There's so many different mediums and forms by which you can solve that context. And you want to be able to combine those patterns into a sort of unique compiled form that solves your problem. And so, yeah, we kind of applied that to SoftSpot and the art gallery problem. I think I'm almost done with time. But yeah, and so my take is that we're in this new medium phase of bringing a lot of social interaction to the digital space. And the reason I think that's relevant here is because, again, digital objects require this context to be meaningful. A Fortnite skin without the game Fortnite doesn't make any sense. Narrative is everything, especially when it comes to this digital good that may not have any innate utility, right? If you think about value of a digital thing as external value, what someone else will pay for it, internal value, like what it means to me, and this like innate value of utility, a lot of digital things, especially in the case of art, won't necessarily have any utility. And so it really just highlights how important the narrative and the storytelling and the broader context that it lives in, how important that is. And so, yeah, I think this is just a call to action to think about these problems from first principles and design, novel solutions. And I think it would be cool if we had a sort of pattern language, to use Christopher Alexander's terms, of digital space, such that, hey, when we're trying to synthesize form, when we're trying to create an app, a digital world, just a website, a wallet, when we're trying to create that, what are the things we want to solve for, and what are the patterns we can use to solve it in ways that are translatory and translate meaning rather than transposing or copying. Yeah. So that is my manifesto, so to speak, of how to think about designing digital space.